So the other end of the continuum related to language theories is the linguistic theory or the nativist theory. And the linguistic theory is one of the most prominent nativist theories, and it's often associated with Noam Chomsky, who felt that children were born with this innate capacity to acquire grammatical rules of their language. And in this theory, the suggestion is made that children can apply this kind of innate morphological syntactic skill to a language as it gradually unfolds. And that really what's unique about humans is that they're born with this ability to discover this rule system in the language with really minimal environmental support. So this theory does not support the idea that parents are doing all of this work to help children learn language, but with just a little bit of environmental data to take in what is innate to the child is unfolding. And the premise of that and the question that's posed is, if we think about how fast children learn language, which is pretty amazing in terms of the rate that they acquire vocabulary and complex syntactic forms and social language use, etc. How could this be something that is just learned in the environment? So your text talks about a couple of other nativist theories, one being the modularity theory. And this reflects the ideas that there are highly specified modules specific to different aspects of language processing. So there's some modules that are uniquely identified and dedicated to learning different aspects of language. And the theory with this is that language has a dedicated neural system, so it's really, there's components of our brain that are just dedicated to learning language, and different modules are responsible for different aspects of language growth. And so those modules interact at higher levels of language, but at lower levels of language, they are really reflecting information in just those different components of language. And again, when we think about this idea of language theory, anyone can come up with a theory, right? I could create a theory today and post it somewhere tomorrow, and not all of these theories have evidence. And from when we talked originally at the onset of language theories, we talked about this idea that for a theory to really be a good one, it's going to have to be able to account for all components of language. It's going to be able to account for language development that's typical as well as atypical, and then we have to be able to scientifically and empirically evaluate its truth. And so not all of these theories fit all of this criteria, but they're the most poignant ones. These are theories that have all been created from some pretty seminal people on the field. So just sort of giving you exposure to these different ideas. The bootstrapping theory comes from this idea of bootstrapping, with the idea, and your text talks about this, is you have a little ring on your boot that can help you to pull it on. And so it's sort of saying, what can you do with aid? What are you able to do with assistance? And that assistance can kind of give you a leg up on things. And so in this theory, they feel that children are born with knowledge of syntactic rules in terms of the syntactic bootstrapping. And it's the syntax that really helps provide them that leg up. And so I gave the example in your notes of, if we know the part of speech a word is, we have a lot of information about it. So if I say, hey, I went zinging today, you already know without having any idea what the word zing means that it's a verb because of where it's placed in the sentence. And the idea with syntactic bootstrapping is that the context in which a word is produced provides a lot of information based on the context around it. In comparative to that, semantic bootstrapping talks about this idea that children are using words and knowledge of words they already have to learn new words. And so that's talking about sort of making these connections to things that are already known. And when you're able to make those connections to things that are already known, that gives you, again, a leg up to be able to learning more words. And then with prosodic bootstrapping, it's suggesting that children are attending to things such as pitch and rhythm and pausing and stress to figure out where and what is a word or clause or phrase. And so there's been really good research that really shows that, young, even infants have this proclivity to be able to attend to the prosody of their native language, be able to make sense of things like word boundaries and clause boundaries. And so, again, we have evidence in that arena to show that the prosody of language definitely helps children to be able to learn language. Some supports for linguistic and nativist profile is that we know that there's a lot of commonalities across languages. And so is there something that's really universal and that children are already born with? I mean, that's given how commonly children learn first words and two-word combinations and subject, verb, object, word order, and so on. Some of that consistency language to language makes it seem like, it's less to do with what's happening in the environment and more to do with maybe some things that children are born into the world with. And also the fact that almost all children develop language. And so you'll see when we start talking about facilitation strategies of what we do in sort of middle class, white, mainstream America to help develop language, people around the world don't all do that, and yet all their children develop language at about the same time as well. And so that's another support for the linguistic perspective. And also that we do know that children, infants arrive into the world with many predisposed skills. And so when I was talking about that ability of prosodic information, helping kids know words and clauses, when we talked about this idea of categorical perception and how they're able to make those categories of sounds and phonology, their predisposition to like really early imitation skills. There's lots of things that babies are born into the world with that support language development. And then some of the negation about whether this theory is a good theory is that we do know that there is a relationship between language input and development. We know that more talk that happens at home has a correlation with how children develop language. So if it was all innate and not about the environment, why would that be? We also know that children do receive input. So we don't have many opportunities to look at situations in which children don't have language input to see what the effect of that is. And in your notes, I made reference to a couple of sort of sad child abuse situations, Jeannie being one of them. And it's a great series that you can watch on YouTube about the story of her life. A sad story, but an interesting story from a language development perspective, with a lot of limitation in terms of language input and definitely see an effect on her and her overall development. But bottom line is that children receive a lot of input, so we can't weed that out as a possible contributor to their growth. And this kind of thing, this linguistic perspective, we see lots of variation among children, even though we just mentioned there's a lot of commonalities. Certainly we have some variables of children who are great language learners and more mediocre language learners. And so if it's all innate to the child, why would that variation happen? And then the other thing is that, the linguistic framework really only tries to explain syntactic development. So again, if we have a good theory that is explaining all components of language, it should be able to explain things like language use and semantics as well. Okay, the next theory that we're going to talk about is the social linguistic theory, social interactionist theory. And this theory really is talking, sort of bridges somewhere between nativist and empiricism, somewhere between that behavior, that nature-nurture kind of philosophy. And in this, theories that are looking at the social component of language really focuses on the communication and the context, with really an emphasis on the role of environment. In this theory, they believe that the social function of language is what's driving children, and so that need to socially connect and socially interact, and potentially the inherent sociability of infants and toddlers and young children is what's driving the need for initial communication and more complex forms of communication. And in this theory, the quality of language of input is really key. So what children are hearing, how people are responding to them in the environment is really a substantial contribution to the way language is learned. And so key is the speaker's intent and the achievement of how effective they are in communication. And there's two sort of key variables there: joint referencing and child-directed speech. In joint referencing, we're talking about sort of the triangulation between an adult, a child, and an object in their environment. And so that's a skill that develops in late infancy, where a child can make that connection of, I'm interested in that ball, I'm looking at my mom, I'm looking at the ball, my mom's looking at me, she's looking at the ball, and so we have a shared referent. And so that's sort of a foundation for that kind of socialness of communication. And we know that joint attention and joint referencing is a really key developmental level of acquisition that provides a foundation for more complex communication. And it seems to be a really substantially missing piece in certain types of neurodevelopmental disabilities like autism. So it's one of the foundations of children with autism often is this very limited or non-developing joint attention. And so that social drive for communication isn't there. The other component of this social interactionist theory talks about this idea of child-directed speech or motherese. And so we would also think about that in the old days as baby talk. And so with that, we're talking about the contributions of language that is shorter in its length in terms of production, more emphasis on the ends of words, more intonation, varying intonation. So, hey, look what Mama has for you. It's a ball. Oh, it's such a pretty ball. So there's an example of motherese that all of you could be very familiar with and probably have used in interacting with children at some point along the way. And so we know from research that has been done that motherese children who hear language in that way, it does facilitate their attention to what is being produced in terms of the information that's being shared. And so children are more attentive to speech that is directed to them using this motherese or this child-directed speech than speech using, a less kind of facilitative strategy. In this interactionist perspective, it's also important to note that the belief is there that neither parent nor child is really just a passive recipient of input directed to them, but it's really the engagement of the child who is engaging the adult, who's engaging the child, that really facilitates that interaction. And so some of the research also looks at the fact that when children are socially driven and socially interacting, adults are more likely to provide more input. So when we talk about infants, we'll talk about early pointing and how when a baby is pointing and babbling, they're much more likely to get input from their caretakers in their environment. So just the overall sheer quantity of input can be increased when that joint referencing has been established and maintained. And so some of the supports for the social interactionist theory is that we know many adults modify speech to children, although it's really important to note that it's not all cultures across the world, and so we can't say that motherese is a critical component of language. Well, although we see it in many languages, we do know that communication is enhanced when an adult follows a child's lead. And so your text talks about this idea of really being in the child's zone of proximal development, meaning that you're really scaffolding for the child where they're at, what they're able to do, and help them to get to a higher level based on that. And so we know that when parents respond to what children are interested in and talk about what children are interested, they're more likely to pay attention and to learn that language and vocabulary related to how the adult has followed their lead. And we also know that what and how the input is delivered also affects the output. But some of the challenges to this theory is that, motherese is not that simple of a language. And so when I'm saying, it's a ball, look, what a pretty blue ball that is. I love that ball. That's not really simple language. It's not like big ball, blue ball, look here. So it's not that simple of a language. We also know that it's not found in all languages, so it can't be that critical component that I just mentioned to you. It doesn't explain overgeneralization. So when we talk about kids who will take syntax like, I play, I played, I dance, I danced, I go, I goed. And so there's an overgeneralization of past tense ed endings there. And so they are never hearing that kind of input. So that doesn't help explain that kind of error that children make. And then there's not a one-to-one correspondence between frequency and presence in language. So children hear lots of articles early on in terms of how adults are sharing information, but those are often omitted in terms of early developing language. And so it's not just a one-to-one relationship. We're going to stop there and talk about our remaining theories in our next lecture together.